Greetings, nature nerds, and welcome to Ask an Ecologist. My name is Suzanne Simpson, and I'm an ecologist for Bayou Land Conservancy here in Houston, Texas. And each week we get together and talk about your nature questions. So let's get to it. I did have a question this week that asked why I never change my background. So I try to film Ask an Ecologist on my back patio whenever I can. And let me give you a exclusive behind the scenes tour of the high production value that is headed your way. So you are sitting on two Harry Potter books. That's where you hang out. And then behind me is basically, I'm sitting on my patio chair. Behind me is my house. And in front of me is my very impressive collection of cat claw vine. And that's basically it. So, until we get an influx in our production budget, which is presently zero, and I think we do pretty well with that, this is going to be the background. Maybe I should invest in different types of backgrounds backdrops that I could put behind me. I don't know, but I'm certainly not creative, so I will rely on other people for that. All right, so let's get to your questions this week. First question that got written in was asking, if you are new to hiking or going on trails, are there non-obvious things that I should be aware of or things that I shouldn't do so I don't disrupt the environment? I'm glad that this question is getting asked because preparing ourselves adequately before we go into an outdoor space is the best way to have a safe recreational experience. Safe for you, the recreator, and safe for your co-recreators, and safe for the environment that you're going to be recreating in. So I went to the website of the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics to answer this question. Leave No Trace is a set of principles that you can adopt to ensure that your outdoor recreation is as gentle on the land as possible and as enjoyable for you as possible. And there are 7 principles that you can abide by. So let's go over them. The first one is plan ahead and prepare. It seems obvious, but I think sometimes people under-prepare when they go outside, especially in the backcountry, because the thought is, well, if anything just goes really wrong, I can always get rescued. And it's not a great idea to rely upon a rescue in a backcountry situation, because rescue is no guarantee. For us on the more front country side of things, especially when it's summer and it's really hot, drinking water before you go out on a trail doesn't mean that you are hydrated. You need to make sure you're always bringing water with you when you're on the trail. So preparing ahead of time, making sure you know where you're going, you know when you're going to be back, and somebody else knows when you're out there is the first principle. The second is travel and camp on durable surfaces. So in short, make sure that you are staying on the trail when you're outdoor. Trails are not randomly placed by people that manage outdoor spaces. Trails are placed where they are because there are certain soil types, there are certain vegetation types that can handle the compacted soil and the impacts of outdoor recreation. And that way you're able to concentrate those impacts of outdoor recreation rather than spreading them all over the land. There are certain parts of the land that will be that will receive that impact and that can handle it accordingly. So going off trail is really not advisable, not only for a getting lost situation, but to minimize your impact on the outdoor environment. The third principle is disposing of waste properly. Along the front country, other than your usual picnic fare, I wanted to emphasize making sure that you're always picking up after your pet. Make sure that you bring a doggy bag with you, even if it means that if there's not a trash can on the trail and you have to carry the dog waste with you as you hike. You know what? During the coronavirus, we're all supposed to be staying away from each other, and if somebody gets close to you, you can just wag your poop bag at them, and that's a great way to make sure that you have a 6-foot radius around you at all times. So that's a really important part of it. And in the backcountry, disposing of your waste usually means disposing of your own waste properly. So making sure you're using a wag bag and only doing outdoor tinkles in approved areas. The fourth principle is leave what you find. It can be really tempting to take cool rocks, pick a bunch of wildflowers. I really encourage you to leave as much behind you as possible and basically take only pictures and leave only your footprints. Number 5 is minimize campfire impacts. Only you can prevent wildfires, and that can be one of the most impactful things that can happen to a natural area. So making sure you're having your campfire in an approved area and that it is all the way out before you leave. Number 6 is respect wildlife. A lot of us are still going to be going to national parks over the summer when they get really busy. And how many times have you seen someone where they're pretty much petting the moose? You know, people get really close, especially to ungulates, to hooved animals. People get really close to moose and elk, and they want to get the great photo. And those are not good behaviors to ingratiate in ourselves and in our wildlife. So we want to make sure that we're keeping a respectful distance from wildlife, and also that we're not killing wildlife in natural areas like snakes that you come across. Go around them, keep a respectful distance, and respect the area that is their home. And number 7 is be considerate of other visitors. Especially in the front country, we have a lot of multi-use trails. So you're going to have people engaging in different types of recreation, possibly using the same trail. So make sure if you're riding a bike, you're calling out rider, you're ringing your bell. You make sure that, you know, if you're a pedestrian, you don't have your headphones in your ears so that you can hear other people as they're coming by you, and just be respectful of everybody on the trail. So those are 7 leave no trace principles that you can implement to minimize your impact of your outdoor recreation and make sure that you're having a good time, everyone else is having a good time, and that the natural resource is conserved. So good question. Okay, our next question is one that nobody asked, but I'm going to answer anyway. And that is my favorite nature podcasts. So I'm going to name 5 of my favorites that I listen to regularly. These aren't the only ones that I listen to, and these aren't in any particular order, but they're 5 that I like to check out on the reg, and you may as well. So the first one is the Squamates podcast. This podcast focuses very specifically on herpetology and a big emphasis on taxonomy. So for any of my herpetology fellow nerds out there who like to geek out on all things reptiles and amphibians, Squamates podcast is a great one for you. The second one that I listen to a lot is Meat Eater. This is done by Steven Rinella, who has the Meat Eater show on Netflix. It may be on an actual television station as well, but I always watch it on Netflix. This podcast has a hunting focus, and within that hunting paradigm, it talks a lot about wildlife management and wildlife conservation, and they have some really fascinating guests that come on that podcast. So that is another really good one to check out. The third one is the Mountain and Prairie podcast. This is done by Ed Robertson, and he focuses on land conservation and sort of the general Americana of the American West. And even though it's focusing on those western states, there are many things that us here in East Texas can apply with the lessons that we've learned out in that neck of the woods. And they also have some really interesting guests that come on there. So Mountain and Prairie podcast. And then the fourth one is just called Nature. It is the podcast of the journal Nature, the scientific journal that publishes peer-reviewed articles. It's a high-impact journal, and they produce a podcast that highlights some of the stories that they're going to be publishing in their Nature journal. So if you want just kind of a quick and dirty on what some of the latest and most interesting research is in the natural world, the Nature podcast is a good one to check out. And then number 5 is the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation podcast. This one does focus quite a bit on donors to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation, but they do also talk about some of the land management issues in Texas and some of the up-and-coming projects with Texas Parks and Wildlife. So if you're interested in learning more about Texas Parks and a little bit of the behind the scenes of what's going on with Texas Parks, I definitely recommend checking out that podcast. Okay, so we are going to switch topics here and talk about anurans, which is frogs and toads, which are one of my absolute favorite topics. My graduate school research was on the Cuban tree frog, which is an invasive species in Florida, and I did my research on that, and I loved it very much, and so I am a big frog nerd. My dog is named after my favorite genus of tree frog, and recently Bayou Land Conservancy did a webinar with a medium-sized group of people about the 15 most common frog calls that you hear in the Houston area. And I'll link to our YouTube recording of that webinar in the comments after I'm done recording this. But I wanted to go over some of the topics that we covered in that webinar. One thing that I think people are too embarrassed to ask, but may still have the question, is what is the difference between frogs and toads? So, in general, first of all, this isn't as clear a science as you might like it to be. Um, in general, toads have shorter legs. They have warty skin or tubercles on their skin. They're more terrestrial. They can live away from water more, and they lay their eggs in a long string of pearls. In contrast, frogs have longer legs, they have smoother skin, and they lay their eggs in a gelatinous ball, and they're generally not far away from water throughout their entire life. To quote Dr. Mark Schertz from the Squamates podcast, basically, the difference between frogs and toads is you have swimmy ones and not so swimmy ones. And that pretty much sums it up. There are some frogs that are toad-like in appearance and some toads that have frog-like qualities. And similar to squares and rectangles, all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So toads are a kind of frog. So that is roughly the difference between the two. But, you know, the taxonomic splits between them just means that we have great job security for herpetologists and geneticists and phylogenists. Another question that people are a little scared to ask is, why do frogs call? Why do frogs and toads call? They call to attract their mates and also to warn away competing males against mating with the female that they're desiring. So about 99% of the calls that you will ever hear are given by a male frog. Female frogs really don't call very much. And so that is basically it. That is their love song, and they are trying to get a female interested in them and to establish their dominance over rival males. Another question that we had during the webinar was wondering if any of our frogs are poisonous. And the only thing that we have that resembles that is our Gulf Coast toad, which is a very common toad here in Southeast Texas. That will secrete a mild toxin, an alkaloid, through their parotid glands whenever they feel threatened. And it's not necessarily harmful to humans, but if your dog swallows a toad, it will probably throw it up because the toad will secrete that, and it'll be very distasteful, and that's their way to warn off predators. But we don't have poisoned dart frogs in the sense that they do in Central and South America. And that family of frogs are thought to receive that alkaloid toxin that they secrete through their skin because of what they eat specifically in that habitat. Whenever you raise poison dart frogs in captivity away from their the insects and the plants that they get in their natural habitat, they tend to not develop that toxin. So none of our frogs here have the toxin in the sense that like poison dart frogs do in the family Dendrobates. Another question that I got about frogs and toads was the question about the chytrid fungus, or the BD fungus. You may have heard of this because it has really devastated some amphibian populations nationwide. In Central America, South America, Australia, parts of Asia have all exhibited these, and parts of the Western United States have exhibited huge amphibian declines that have been attributed to, at least in part, by this chytrid fungus. What is interesting about the southeastern United States is that chytrid is fairly ubiquitous here. A lot of amphibians, and when I say amphibians, I'm also including salamanders in that, have tested positive for chytrid, but we haven't experienced the same amphibian declines related to chytrid specifically. And for a while, it was posited that perhaps chytrid is endemic to the southeastern United States, and that's why our amphibians aren't affected by them, but that hasn't really played out in the research. But just because we don't have huge declines because of chytrid, first of all, it doesn't mean we never could. If there's anything that we're learning in our world right now, it's that emerging diseases and evolving diseases can really change the landscape of how an ecosystem operates, so that's always possible. And also our amphibians are susceptible to other types of pathogens, so disease is an issue for them. It's just not specifically the chytrid fungus. And then lastly, we talked in the webinar about creating a habitat for tree frogs in your own backyard. So if you have a source of water in your backyard, you can have a tree frog house. And it's really easy to create, and it's a super simple quarantine project, especially if you have little ones. What you can do is buy about a 3 to 5 foot long PVC pipe that's about 3/4 inch long. You don't want the really thick PVC pipe, you want it to be a little bit of the thinner material. And you can hammer that next to your water source and have the pipe extend about 3 feet high, and poke a hole in it, drill a hole in it about 1/3 of the way down so that it can drain if it fills with water. And then check it every day or every week to see if you have any tree frogs moving in. They really love the PVC pipe refugia. Whenever I did my field collections of Cuban tree frogs, that's almost entirely how I got them from, was PVC pipes that I had installed. It keeps them warm when it's cold, and it cools them off when it's hot. It provides a cozy place for them to hang out during the day. And a good place to return to when they're done with their nightly activities. So make your backyard an Aneurin habitat and a tree frog habitat, and let me know if you get any tree frogs in your backyard. Additionally, if you have any favorite nature podcasts that I didn't mention, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Submit your questions weekly to Ask an Ecologist to info@bayouland.org, or you can leave a comment and I will get to them. We'll talk to you next week. This is Suzanne Simpson with Bayou Land Conservancy. Thanks for hanging out, guys.